Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for the video series titled Teaching and Learning Evidence-Based Relationships, Interviews with the Experts. This project is brought to you by the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy, APA Division 29, and is a companion project to the third edition of Psychotherapy Relationships That Work. The overall goal of the project is to translate relationship research to teaching and learning from the classroom context to clinical supervision. My name is Dr. Raina Markin, and today we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Barry Farber, Professor of Psychology and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he runs the Psychotherapy, Affirmation, and Disclosure Lab. The topic of today's discussion is how to translate research on positive regard and affirmation to teaching and training. Thank you so much for joining us, Barry.
You're very welcome, Raina. Good to talk with you.
You too. So I was wondering if you could just start by defining positive regard and affirmation, how you operationalize it in your research. So if you could just start there, that would be great.
Let's start there. So this is somewhat difficult, like many other concepts. There isn't a single consensus definition, but essentially we're talking about two aspects, and maybe we can think of a continuum. One aspect, or one part of the continuum, is the notion itself of positive regard, which essentially translates to liking, caring, affirmation, support, and respect. But there's another part that sort of confuses the notion of positive regard, and that's the notion of conditions of worth. That has less of an affective valence to it and more of a sense of just accepting who the person is without any preconditions. And Rogers himself, who of course began, the study of the necessary and sufficient conditions for psychotherapy, offered multiple opportunities for defining the notion of positive regard, sometimes talking about positive regard, sometimes unconditional positive regard. But what we have now is essentially a sense of holding the client, of caring for the person, of making sure that he or she knows that he or she has our respect, our affirmation, our support.
Mm-hmm. And do you think today the way we look at or define positive regard and affirmation is different than how Rogers initially conceptualized it?
Well, it has changed over the years because I think it's come to have the component of where there's an affective valence to it more than the conditions of worth piece. So where Rogers mostly talked about simple acceptance of the person, regardless of his or her behavior or attitudes, which might be discrepant for ours, in more recent, say the last 20 or 30 years, it has come to take on the second meaning somewhat more of an act of caring, an act of showing from the therapist's perspective of how much I really like you, support you, care for who you are as a human being.
So what were some of the main findings in this recent meta-analysis that you and your collaborators did for the upcoming edition of the new edition of Psychotherapy Relationships?
So I think we had two exciting findings. One, of course, was the fact that there was a significant relationship we found in the meta-analyses based on 64 studies between the therapist's provision of positive regard and therapeutic outcome. It was a small finding, it was a modest finding, but it was significant. So in that sense, we corroborated previous research that indicated that this was an important component of the therapeutic relationship. Certainly not an exhaustive component, but a small piece of an overall sense of what the relationship needs to be in a caring, healing way. The second piece, which was interesting, was that we didn't find any significant mediators or moderators. And while that, in some sense, was surprising, in another sense, we've come to regard that as a rather positive finding, meaning that it doesn't matter who the person is, it doesn't matter the characteristics of the client, it doesn't matter the characteristics of the therapist, including his or her theoretical orientation. Rather, this sense of the therapist providing positive regard seems to work irrespective of any of the specific characteristics of patient, therapist, or the system. That was a good finding for us. This is an important piece of virtually every kind of psychotherapy.
And when in most of these studies, was the feeling of positive regard and affirmation, was that from the therapist's point of view or from the patient's point of view?
It was both. For the most part, most of the studies, per Rogers, by the way, are from the patient's point of view. That is, what Rogers said initially and consistently about his three necessary and sufficient conditions, those being the positive regard, empathy, and genuineness, also called congruence.
Yeah.
He said that those conditions, for them to be effective, couldn't exist just in the therapist's behavior or the therapist's mind, but had to be perceived and experienced by the patient, him or herself. So consistent with that, and for us that was a good thing, most of the studies have in fact been from the patient's perspective.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, because I was wondering if there was sort of a difference in, if there's enough study to look at sort of if there's a different effect size outcome.
Right, we did look at that and it didn't seem to matter.
Yeah, that's
there were some studies from the therapist's perspective and as well from observers' perspective as well.
And it'd be interesting to see if those two match, you know, if
that's right.
This perspective.
There's
yeah.
a different sense of congruence, and you know, not what Rogers meant by congruence, but rather
right.
statistical congruence.
Right, exactly. And I think something that I talk about with my students too is that even if there is like this small effect size statistically between things like positive regard and affirmation and outcome, the absence of it
makes a difference.
Right. Might have a bigger effect, so to speak. Right.
And this is where we get into interesting, I think, theoretical perspectives. Because from a humanistic, a Rogerian perspective, or even from contemporary psychodynamic relational perspective, the relationship may be mutative in and of itself, particularly from a humanistic perspective. That's what's healing.
Yeah.
From a psychodynamic perspective, it's more like we need to talk about the relationship in order to inform the way that clients form attachments in other relationships. So it's a means to understanding. But even now from a CBT perspective, the relationship, including positive regard, is seen as foundational for other potentially mutative interventions. But in every kind of therapeutic system, even if there's different ways of understanding its importance, it still remains important.
Yeah. So I guess given these findings, you know, what advice do you have for educators in terms of training students on facilitating and I guess expressing positive regard and affirmation with clients?
Right. So there's a few things to be said about that. One is, it's a bit of a cliche, but everyone should be watching the Gloria tape that Rogers made in 1964. I've probably seen it 40 times literally, but you can still learn something every time you see it.
Yeah.
And students learn something every time they see it. Not, of course, just about positive regard, but about the way that one conveys an overall attitude of caring for the patient. There's an openness for Rogers. There's certainly extraordinary empathy. So I would say viewing as many tapes as possible of Rogers' work is a great beginning for understanding the nature of positive regard. There's another piece that some of my students and I have begun to work on, which is trying to understand more fully the components of positive regard. Because it's an attitude, but how does that attitude translate into some behavioral manifestations in the here and now of the therapeutic situation, right? So we interviewed and surveyed a lot of clients and asked them a couple of questions, actually a fair number of questions about what they regarded as the most potent forms of positive regard a therapist could or has already provided for them. And we actually found out that a fair amount of positive regard is conflated with empathy. That is, to the extent that a therapist begins to try to understand deeply who you are, who this client is, you feel respected and supported. So it's almost impossible to entirely, and Rogers understood this, it's almost impossible to entirely tease out these three components. In fact, statistically, they tend to overlap. So back to your question, you watch tapes of Rogers, you begin to understand or have dialogues with your students about the ways in which they've already think they've provided positive regard to their clients. And you hope that it's not simply with a string of compliments or gratuitous compliments. It's not just about that. It's a lot more subtle than that. There's body language ways. There's empathy. There's smiling. There's even silence that conveys acceptance. So I think the way to do it, like a lot of the relational components is not just seeing others, the masters at work, providing empathy or positive regard, but reviewing students' work and going over with them what they think or how they think that they've conveyed this attitude, and perhaps the ways in which they think further work with this client or other clients, what else they could do, to provide this condition for them.
Mm-hmm. And so what about in situations where the student, doesn't like the client, so
Right.
and doesn't accept and understand them? I mean, as an educator, as a supervisor, sort of how would you approach that situation?
Thank you for that terrific question.
You're welcome.
I love that question. Rogers himself struggled with this. He said that he wished that his genuine component would be manifest in a way such that if he didn't like a client, he'd actually express that thought. In fact, every tape I've ever seen, I never saw him express that particular thought. So it was more of an abstract notion that he thought it would come through. My sense, to answer your question a little more directly, I think one tries hard to find at least a single component of the client that one can feel good about, even if it's just the fact that this person who may have committed some really dastardly acts, disreputable behaviors, is now in therapy trying to do something about it. So I think you find a piece that you can connect with, and you work off of that piece. Now that may be a particular struggle if the person is mandated for therapy and doesn't really want to be there. But in that case, too, you can work with it. As long as we're here together, what is it that you think we can profitably work on? And as long as you find some traction for the person's connection with you, I think then you can find a way of believing that this person has goodness in them that you can then reflect in some good ways and let them know that you do care for them, you do affirm them, you do respect them.
Yeah. No, I think that's good advice. And I think that in my experience with students, a big part of it, like you were saying earlier, is helping them to empathize with someone.
Right.
And it's hard, I think, to have genuine positive regard for someone when you can't find something to empathize with them.
Totally agree. That's right. I tell my students, when in doubt, empathize.
Yeah. I think
Right.
some struggles that I have as an educator is when students are seeing clients that it's hard for them to empathize with because they don't want to identify with these clients that have done such awful things. So it's hard for them to feel like they can identify with someone who has committed a sexual assault or some really awful thing, that it's hard to identify and empathize with someone.
Right. Of course, to be empathic, to be positive regarding isn't to corroborate the act.
Right.
It's to say, let me try to understand what this was about for you, or let me understand why you're here in order to make sense of what you did, which I now think you want to work on such that this is not part of who you are as a human being.
Yeah.
We help our students distinguish between empathy and identification.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction with students, that empathy and identification. Yeah, I think that's really crucial with this. So, I mean, are there readings, websites, or, videos? You mentioned the Gloria video, which I, always use and think is wonderful. But are there any other resources that you would recommend, either to use in supervision or classroom?
Right. So, again, Rogers has multiple other videos, and I think all his work is well worth reviewing. James Bugenthal, another humanistic existential therapist, his work is worth reviewing. He's very positive regarding and holding. Somewhat patting myself on the back, but I've written a book where Rogers' cases are sort of compiled in one volume called Rogers Casebook. So you can, because all his cases are not quite videoed, so people can read his work. Art Bohart, a friend and colleague, has written wonderful pieces about the specific aspect of positive regard that he's calling, that Rogers has called conditions of worth, which Art thinks is central to doing good client-centered work, that one simply has no notion of judging this client, that one accepts the client as he or she is. And Art has written some books, some of them with Robert Elliott, actually, with Les Greenberg, with Jeannie Watson, some articles where they focus mostly on empathy, but again, understand and have written about how empathy and positive regard, particularly this notion of conditions of worth, are conflated, and how one, puts out as much as possible the sense of acceptance for the client in that, in multiple forms.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so in your teaching, either in the classroom or in clinical supervision, do you have any measures that you use to either, that you encourage students to use with their clients in session, or that you just use as a teaching tool in the classroom?
What I use as a teaching tool, Carl Truax, who was one of Roger's collaborators at Chicago, has what he calls the relationship questionnaire. And I go over that with my students and show them the ways in which positive regard, has been operationally defined by Truax. It's not a terrific measure, and it's an old measure, and 1960s measure. And one of the problems now with positive regard, we don't have new measures of this concept. My student Jessie Suzuki and I, who was one of the co-authors on the positive regard chapter, she and I have been working on a new measure of positive regard that allows for more variations in how therapists, provide positive regard, again, in terms of some empathy tinged positive regard, some nonverbal positive regard, some tonal qualities positive regard, some overt compliments positive regard. So I don't think that's quite ready, to be disseminated, until we do some more methodological work on it. But I'm hoping that our work and perhaps some others, will lead to better measures of positive regard that, that both researchers and students can use.
And that measure that you're creating now, is that from like an outside rater's perspective, or the patient or client's perspective?
The latter, it's from the client's perspective.
That's great. Yeah. I guess I'm curious, in your experience, if you have found that positive regard is directly talked about in training. I mean, it's on one hand, it's such like a basic
Right.
construct that, like you said, goes throughout almost, every theoretical orientation in some way. I mean, do you find that this is something that is explicitly addressed in training programs?
No.
I'll
elaborate a bit.
Okay.
I think it's a great question, actually. I think what's happened is that rather than the specific components of Roger's three conditions being spoken about differentially, they've now sort of been taken together, so that we now, with one exception, I think that might be empathy. I think empathy is talked about, but certainly not the other two conditions, positive regard or genuineness. So rather what we have is either empathy, one of the three conditions talked about, or even more so, this whole notion of the relationship being central. And virtually everyone now, both researchers and clinicians, are talking about, the centrality of the relationship. We all know Marv Goldfried, a great thinker and one of the founders of CBT. Years ago, in one of the SPR conferences, Marv famously said we should all get bumper stickers. All the SPR members should get bumper stickers. It says, "It's the relationship, stupid." So people are talking about the relationship. But again, I don't think they're talking about the specific components of it. We're a little bit now, mostly per Clara, about self-disclosure, which is not quite, but consistent somewhat with Roger's notion of genuineness and transparency. We have the great new work of Charlie Gelso on the real relationship, which is also, consistent with genuineness and the way that, the two parties in the room connect with each other, but not so much positive regard. I think there's still a legacy particularly in the psychodynamic community, of not quite thinking that Rogers, was a substantial enough thinker, and thinking that positive regard was sort of, more the copper of suggestion, than the gold of interpretation. That it was too light. That holding clients deeply was not the way for true healing. Though obviously psychodynamic thinking is, not what it was in terms of its influence compared to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I still think we have that in the psychotherapeutic community, where we don't quite honor some of the contributions of Rogers or other humanistic or existential therapists as much as I think they deserve.
Or maybe, I think some of it too is maybe related to that, is that we take it for granted that, of course we have positive regard. Of course.
Maybe, I think you're right, actually. Maybe we take it for granted.
Kind of take it for granted. So yes, along those lines, what are some of the common challenges that you come across when training students on how to facilitate positive regard?
I love that question too. Again, it's not that they too often think of positive regard as a synonym for complimenting the patient, and have to learn over and over again that it's an attitude. It's not just a phrase that says I care about you. You're more manifesting it in multiple ways than you're saying specific things. The problem in a way is, even though I've touted, others have touted the value of watching the Gloria film, the phrase that everyone remembers from the Gloria film is when Roger says to her something, "I think you'd make a pretty good daughter too."
Yep.
Which is sort of a positive regarding statements. Everyone, or too often anyway, students hold on to that statement and need to be reminded that the statement was powerful, and perhaps even, an instance of a corrective emotional experience. But that's an example of something that needs to be more expanded in terms of an entire attitude, rather than the kind of specific statements that one can sometimes make. Mm-hmm. But just like in Clara Hill's work, about self-disclosure and immediacy statements, the value of overt positive regarding statement probably resides in its relative scarceness. That is, if you continually positively regarding your patients, quite specifically with statements, it loses its potency. It only works when it feels like it's genuine and specific to something courageous, perhaps, that your patient has done. Otherwise, again, it's a kind of, a leaning forward,
right?
A remembering of what you've told me, a genuine respect for you, an acceptance of what you are, a sense of understanding. All of those are more important than specifically complimentary statements.
Yeah.
And that's what students have to be reminded of.
Yeah. No, I think it's an important point. And it's always interesting to me that some of when I show that Gloria video, that statement you mentioned about, you make a pretty good daughter, that some of my classes love that. And some of my classes are repulsed by it. They think,
why are they repulsed?
I think because they think it's creepy is the word that they use. Yeah.
It's too close.
Yeah.
It's too intimate.
Yeah.
It's boundary breaking.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I've gotten that too. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But it really varies. The reactions to that really vary.
Right. And of course, consistent with what you're saying, I think our students have to learn that the kind of positive regard they're providing for client A is necessarily going to be different than from client B. One needs to think about, students need to think about, we all need to think about, how is this client going to receive, what I'm giving?
Absolutely.
And that's not invariant. I want to be invariant in providing positive regard, but I don't want to be invariant in the way that I'm manifesting it.
Yeah. Important point. Yeah. So what do you think are some of the important lessons from, this research that you and your collaborators have done for, for psychotherapy educators, for students to take away?
Yeah, it's that they're learning, that is, students are certainly learning about the importance of the relationship, but I'd like them to remember that there are specific components of the relationship as per this video series, as per John Norcross and Mike Lambert and Bruce Wampolt's, 2 books that are forthcoming. It's the relationship is important, but don't hold the relationship, as something that doesn't have component aspects that one needs to consider. And one of the important component aspects, is the sense of positive regarding acceptance of your patient. That's often, a part of a not quite whole relationship piece. It's often conflated with empathy per se. But, to be quite aware that, as Kohut said, as William James said, that perhaps nothing is as important in life as feeling cared about.
Yeah, I love that quote.
That we all want to feel special. We all, we're all looking for what Kohut, who, by the way, worked with Rogers, or we're looking for those people in our lives who make us feel cared about and special. And that's not pathological narcissism. That's healthy narcissism, as Kohut pointed out. Mm-hmm. And that our task as therapists is to provide for everyone's need to feel cared about and special through, providing multiple ways of letting patients know that we care about them.
That's great. And I guess lastly, where do you think we need to go in the future in terms of training, in terms of research? What are the next steps?
Better measures, more up-to-date videos about the way that positive regard, is being manifest. The way that people are doing therapy now in some ways, is consistent with 40 or 50 years ago, but in other ways has changed. There is much more focus on the relationship. But the question, students might have now, as they should have, is within this focus on, how are we with each other? What are the patterns of relationship that we can look at? I think we need more up-to-date work on how constituent components of the relationship really play out, in contemporary forms of psychotherapy, including, of course, CBT, which is the most common form of therapy now practiced in this country.
Great. Well, this has been really helpful, I think, for educators, supervisors, students. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Delightful to talk with you, Raina.
You too, Barry. Take care.
You too.